Welcome to memoQ Talks, where we talk to industry leaders about their experiences, lessons learned, and what works best across all areas of localization. Now here's your host.
Hello everybody, welcome to memoQ Talks. My name is Mark Schreiner and I'll be your host for this episode of memoQ Talks. Today we're going to be talking with Tom Alwood, who is the CTO or Chief Technology Officer at Peter Clark. And we're going to be talking with Tom about how a company decides whether they should develop their own technologies or should they buy something off the shelf, or should they do maybe a hybrid model where they develop their own and then try to integrate it with some off the shelf tools. Before we do that, though, I'd like to welcome Tom. Tom, how are you today?
Yeah, very great. Thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. I'm out here in sunny Arizona, and where are you at?
I'm in Brooklyn, New York.
Brooklyn, New York. Awesome. And I see you got quite a library behind you. I'm impressed.
Well, I work from a home office.
No, it's great. I mean, but obviously you like reading, or somebody in your family does. But it looks like I can't see the titles, but it looks like a quite the variety of different books.
Well, my background is training as an historian, where I also studied languages, so I still maintain an interest in those sort of areas. So a lot of books on language and history.
Interesting. Have you? I'm sure you must have. But have you read *Sapiens*?
No, I don't think I have.
Okay, that's Yuval Noah Harari. I mean, it was out last year. I'm on my second time through it, but it basically starts way back in prehistory, and talks about how this concept of we have this concept that humans are they're just Homo sapiens, but actually there were many different species of humans, and sapiens were the ones to make it this far. Anyway, that's a whole nother topic. Tom, you've got a really interesting background because you've worked in technology roles with Donnelley, Merrill Corporation, Bowne. You actually have a couple adjunct professor roles that you teach technology related to translation to. And currently, as I mentioned, you're the CTO at Peter Clark. What are your thoughts? I mean, how would, in all these different organizations, how do you decide when you should develop a tool versus let's just buy something off the shelf?
Well, I think in my earliest years in the translation industry, and I first entered it in 1994, there wasn't a lot of option in terms of commercial translation technologies other than CAT tools. But in terms of what we might call TMS or BMS or translation business management systems, back then there weren't a lot of options. And so most companies did develop their own, whether it was a lightweight internal access database application, which were probably some of the earliest, to then more web-based ones. So I think from the earliest days, I got used to helping develop those kind of systems. The first one I ever worked on was for a small LSP, and we did it in Lotus Notes Domino. And then as I moved companies within the translation industry into more corporate entities, um, um, large corporations, first Merrill Corporation, then R.R. Donnelley, and then Bowne and Company. These were large corporations that had their own infrastructures and really wanted internal technologies that could operate with other internal corporate systems. So I just really continued working in those areas of kind of developing tools. And then I went out and became a consultant and got into the academic end of the translation industry. As you mentioned, I teach translation technologies and project management at NYU and occasionally at the University of Maryland. Um, I kind of focused on, as a consultant, helping companies develop their own technologies, and that's how I first got introduced to Peter and Clark because of contacts there, and they're needing help in this area because they had tried a number of different commercial translation business management solutions, starting in really the mid 2000s up to 2010, and had a lot of frustration with that. So I was trying to help them get those on board, um, to learn how to use those tools better, which I've done with many different companies with many different commercial systems, both translation memory systems, and other CAT tools, as well as different business management tools. And at some point, they were feeling a great deal of frustration about the limitations some of the commercial business management solutions were,
Can
um,
can you
putting on how they managed work.
can you give some examples of those limitations and then what you and Peter
Yeah,
Clark was looking to achieve?
yeah. Well, first off, is just, um, how a system works and its internal workflow. Um, a lot of systems have a predefined way of approaching work that you would then have to adapt to. And at some point, either that is a comfortable fit or it is not. And if it isn't a comfortable fit, you immediately start thinking, well, I wish the system worked this way. And you start developing ideas about what your ideal system could do. And I think a lot of people have that frustration with existing translation technologies that maybe were developed on sort of different logical premises,
Hmm.
than what you might want yourself. Now, Peter and Clark is an agency based in Luxembourg, and it specializes in the financial translation sector.
Hmm.
So it works with a lot of, especially, investment fund companies, banks, other financial institutions to handle their particular requirements. And they felt like the existing tools that they used did not meet the workflow and the way they wanted to manage their clients, in the same way. And then on top of that, they were having difficulty that if you're working in certain industries, such as financial, those clients have a very high security expectation because the
Right.
data you're often handling can be quite sensitive.
Hmm.
And we were getting annual security reviews, which are really quite stringent because these companies are meeting the SOC 2 and other financial industry security standards. And these existing systems often did not perform well in those evaluations.
Hmm.
So that eventually led to the idea of we can develop a better mousetrap that meets our needs better and will meet those security needs that our clients are demanding, better than the other commercial systems out there.
Okay, well, that's a pretty bold decision because I in fact I've been involved with significantly sized LSPs who have opted in both directions. One to buy off the shelf for everything, the other ones that wanted to try to develop their own tools for everything. And in the last instance, where the company wanted to develop, they wanted to do not just a BMS, they wanted to do the whole TMS, integrated BMS. They were going to do it on their own. They invested several $1 million, and they came to realize that, you know what, it's a heck of a lot more complicated than it looks at from the outside. And there's so many different rabbit holes that you can go down. Now, in your case, you're talking about, the BMS, which is one part of the supply chain or the project management workflow. Um, Let me ask you: once you decided to go ahead and develop your BMS, then what are the next steps? Do you start scoping, or do you start looking for developers? How does that work?
Um, yes. Now, I had experience in my past work having developed other business management systems. So this is actually the fifth system I've developed from the ground up. So
Mhm.
um, we partnered with a local company that had programming resources in Luxembourg, um, and I'm managing those resources directly. We eventually brought on those developers internally to the company, instead of partnering. We still partner with that same IT services company to help manage infrastructure of everything,
So
but the
just
developers we
let
actually
me
brought
stop for a second,
internally.
because I mean this is the first time that I've heard anybody hire developers in Luxembourg. Okay. I mean,
Yeah.
most of the time people are, or they're outsourcing to Eastern Europe, to Russia, to India, possibly Vietnam. This is, I mean, and I've been involved with several development projects. I've never heard of anybody outsourcing to a team in Luxembourg. Luxembourg is not the lowest cost place in the world. And I'm wondering about the supply of developers, but let me ask you the rationale behind that. I mean, just because they were next to your company
Well,
there?
they were local, convenient.
Hmm.
That was the initial. Now we have core members um, who were hired there, but we also have a wider network of people we bring in that are based in India.
Oh, you do?
So
Okay.
we do kind of both.
Gotcha.
Um, and even now, some of our developers who were originally in Luxembourg are now more geographically distributed. Um, so that's one of the things about the current world is you can
Be
work
anywhere.
from just about anywhere, and sometimes people move. So we've actually, um, right now we're talking about a team that's on 4 different continents.
Excellent.
I'm in the U.S. We have people in Luxembourg. We have someone in South Africa. We have someone. We have got a couple members in India as well. So it's a very international and widely distributed team.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and your development process can continue 24/7 then, because you're all around the world. Um, Let me ask you
Yes.
again, back at the beginning, how did you scope out exactly what you, I mean, were you responsible for scoping out the features and functions that you needed to build into this? I mean, because there's a scoping process, and then there's a, okay, which platform are we going to use? Which, what are we going to develop this on? So maybe you can kind of walk us through that.
Yeah. Yes, I was responsible for that. Now, since I had already been working in financial industry, document services companies, I knew a lot of the requirements Peter and Clark had
Hmm.
that they needed to meet their client expectations. So I came in with that background, um, working closely with the people there. Was hearing their pain points in the systems they were currently using, and together we came up with specifications that we scoped out. I did a prototype in a program called Axior, which makes an interactive HTML um, prototype so
Hmm.
people can try to get a real feeling of how it would work before we actually ever engage programmers. So we were able to make out a fairly detailed specifications for programmers to sit down with. And of course, there's always a trial and error period. You have to bring in your programmers, try them out to see how they're working, because there's always that frustration of people who understand the business logic of what they want, and then developers who understand the programming logic, and sometimes there's a disconnect between the two. And I kind of feel like that's the role I play in bridging the two. I've been in translations for a long time. I've been an operations manager, a project manager. So I've even done some sales. So I have that background to fully understand the business logic. But I've worked also in translation technologies and technology development long enough. I know things from the programmer's point of view too. So I can quote unquote translate between the two groups so we can get something that actually works the way we want. Because programmers will often make certain assumptions because people haven't explained things clearly to them,
Sure.
and will put together something which then being used does not meet expectations.
Yeah.
So it's really getting those specifications down clearly so they know exactly what functionality you want. Makes a really big difference to the development cycle.
Absolutely, scoping in very detailed, and I like this the tool that you mentioned, where you can create kind of an HTML interactive mock-up of what you're trying to build before you send it off development, and then they develop the wrong tool and send it back to you, or the wrong functionality, so you can kind of catch that or nip that in the bud.
Yeah.
Um, So what are some, if you were giving advice to somebody that was, managing a development process like this? I mean, what are some like lessons learned or best practices that you'd like to share? Obviously, you just shared one was the importance of scoping very correctly and communicating the exact functionality requirements in the language that the programmers can understand. Anything else though?
Well, really understanding what you're getting into, because doing self development is not easy. It
Hmm.
is a long term commitment, both financially and just for supporting the people working on it, as well as having your internal people realize, they have to be involved. They have to clearly state what they need, and everyone being coordinated on it. So it is a real burden. And so a lot of companies, I actually kind of try to dissuade them from doing that, although I think doing it can be a great thing. Um, just because I think they can get used to existing commercial tools if they learn them well enough.
Hmm.
And that's one of the big gaps in this industry is there's a lot of tools out there, both in terms of translation memory or CAT tools, translation environment tools, as well as the more business oriented tools to manage your internal business, that people really just don't learn these tools well enough and don't realize what they're capable of and just get frustrated. So I think there is a real discovery process going on that you need to do to really try out tools to see if they fit for you. And if they don't, then realizing that undergoing this process is actually can be painful. It can be a long-term investment, but it also can be an investment that has real payoffs. And also deciding what aspects of it can actually be incorporated with existing technology. So one of the decisions we made early on was we know the business aspects we want in our system, but we're not going to try to develop our own um, CAT or a translation environment aspect of that. And that came together of how we partnered with memoQ to incorporate memoQ's technology into our platform as well. And originally, that began as having two separate platforms
Hmm.
where we would handle a lot of the business logic just in creating a project for recording purposes, financial purposes, issuing POs to our translators, but then managing that work manually in the memoQ separately.
Right.
And then, of course, then was the next big task of using APIs to integrate the two systems. And we put a lot of effort then into that to make a seamless platform.
Well, first off, thank you for mentioning memoQ. Always like that. But
Well, we're big
let,
memoQ supporters. So,
Hey, just keep saying that. All right, that's good. No, but seriously though, I'm sure that you had an evaluation process to figure out. Okay, look, we're developing this BMS. We want to have some type of partnership or integration at some level with the TMS. And as you mentioned, there are many different tools out there. How do you decide? I mean, because what's the evaluation process? You can't just go click around a few things. I mean, I would assume that you have a structure and process. In fact, I looked at your LinkedIn profile, and I think one of the subjects that you teach at the universities is how to evaluate different tools. So, what is the process or structure you use to evaluate tools?
well, one of the things I tell both translators and project managers who are using translation technologies is one of the most important things you can do is actually find out which tools you're the most comfortable with, which tools kind of have an internal logic that feels natural to you, because a tool you're comfortable using is a tool you're more willingly going to use and learn how to use well. I find a lot of people adopt a tool just because they may have heard other people like it or
Hmm.
read industry press on it or something, and then they get in there and they find it really confusing and difficult to use. Translators are not always technology oriented,
Hmm.
and have trouble sometimes using some technologies. So I encourage them to try different tools. Just don't try a tool and say, "Oh, I don't like this tool, therefore all
All tools are
translation
bad.
technology
Yeah.
is bad." Yes. So when I teach translation technologies in universities to translators, we actually learn like 5 or 6 different tools for people to get hands on with the different ones to see which ones they find the most comfortable using. And it's interesting because every semester I teach this, there'll be some students that like this tool, other students like that other tool. And so there's always going to be a mix, and they can walk away thinking, I'm going to use this technology if I feel comfortable using it. So we went, and for Peter and Clark, we did try out a number of different CAT tools. Now, there's a number of factors in there beyond just comfort of use. It's, you know, of course, price point is always an issue. How
Hmm.
much is it going to cost to use this tool? Because we're talking about then being on a server version of a tool. So you have to look at that. What is sort of the security posture of that tool? If it's only a SaaS offering, how does that figure into your own corporate security standards,
Hmm.
and how you might represent that to your clients? And how willing is that company to partner with you in terms of your own development? Because we're integrating with your tool, we need technical support from that tool's end to successfully do that. And that is a lot of back and forth. And we found in memoQ a good partner for that. They were willing to work with us, even though we aren't one of the biggest companies. They weren't going to ignore us. memoQ was willing to work with us, and we had a very successful relationship, I think, with that in integrating the tools. And we've done a lot of it, I think, pretty innovative stuff with our integration that you don't find in a lot of other commercialized business management systems. And what I mean by that is we have something where we call a forward and backwards uh, compatibility with memoQ. So
Hmm.
we both have the ability to originate a project in our BMS and send it over to memoQ, get files back as they're completed. But we also have the ability to set up a project directly in memoQ to take advantage of many of memoQ's import features and other features like the content connector. Set up a project in memoQ first, and then have the our BMS reach over and get that data into a project in our system. So you can originate a project from either end using the strengths of both tools and still arriving at the same ability to record financial information, issue POs while still getting word counts against your translation memories, and taking advantage of both tools, because memoQ has a lot of wonderful features which are not always incorporated in a BMS, just because it would be a lot of complicated programming time that you can just do directly in memoQ, and no sense reproducing that in your BMS if you can just do it in memoQ and then bring the project over. Likewise, memoQ has this capability of integrating with a lot of external systems, which means we don't have to reinvent that sort of integration capability in our systems if we can just piggyback on memoQs. So, with a lot of clients, we've integrated with memoQ's content connectors as well as memoQ's web services API to connect to client systems.
Well, and I was not going to interrupt you with a question because you were just saying all these great things about memoQ. So again, thank you for that. And I think it's very educational.
Please
I
interrupt me.
I would actually think we should get a separate session where we actually do a deep dive on your integration with memoQ. But let me back up a second. Before you were
And
talking
we
about,
actually have,
go ahead. Go
sorry,
ahead. I'm not going to
we've
interrupt you.
actually done uh, another video with memoQ that's on the memoQ site about our specific tool and the integration.
Oh, great. I'm going to get
So
afterwards. I'll get a
that's
link to
something
that.
people can check out.
Yeah, I'll put a link to that in the show notes here. But let me back up a second, as I said, and because you talked about the importance of intuitiveness of a tool, or ease of just, do I feel comfortable using this tool? And we really believe that's incredibly important, especially on the cat side, so that translators just get in there. They don't want to learn yet one more tool. They just want to get their job done, right? And we try to make it as easy as possible to do that. At the same time, on the project management side with the TMS, it's intuitive, but as you know, project management, there's so many different workflows and they can be really, really complex. And there are so many different kind of nuances in terms of how you use the tool. So let me ask you this. How important is training, and how do you manage that as you're developing a new tool?
Well, training is very important. Documenting all the system features for reference purposes, as well as actually doing hands-on training with people. So, of course, we also have test servers where we can have people who are just starting out play with the system,
Hmm.
so they can do it and not damage live work or anything else on a production server. And then doing training sessions, having training recordings that they can reference. Um, you know, knowing how to use a tool is very important, and I think that has been one of the biggest gaps overall within the translation industry of people just not learning to use their technologies very well. And so, um, and this goes across the board of people not even taking advantage of, memoQ's got a YouTube channel with a lot of very useful videos on how to use the technology, and a lot of people don't even know that,
Hmm.
and haven't referenced any of that. Um, so I think it's also encouraging people to go out and look for resources when they don't realize they exist or haven't been handed to them on a silver platter. But then also having that live training thing, because it's usually when people are sitting there and trying to work through the steps of how to create a project and how to assign a translator and so forth from the project manager, and how to attach the right translation memory, all those things. It's when you're actually sitting with them live, step by step, in a meeting, that those questions come up that you can solve instantly if you're with them in person or doing it live, online in a meeting. um, that's really important too, because people can watch videos, they can read a manual, they're only going to learn it when they're hands on.
No, I totally agree with you. And one of the problems is a lot of project managers or users of tools, doesn't even matter, regardless of any tool out there, we don't know what we don't know. So sometimes you might not even realize that this other automated workflow or this other feature or function is even an option, because you're so used to doing it the old regular way. And so you would never even know to look for a new way to do that. And I think that's where the live workshops or instructions, or even have a more experienced trainer shadow a project manager and say, hey, I see what you're doing, but here's another way of doing that. And I've seen that happen many times where they're just like, oh my gosh, that is awesome. Saves a lot of time.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I always try to do is both encourage all the project managers as well as the supervisory personnel to always keep in mind, if people are running into a repetitive task, that they're having to spend a lot of offline time on it, talk to me.
Hmm.
Let's sit down and understand that problem, because there probably is an automated way of fixing that problem. And you'd be surprised by how many file prep steps and other things could be automated in some way.
Hmm.
And, so then I'll set up let's say a memoQ project template that might involve a lot of complex steps, and the project manager wouldn't know how to do that themselves, but I can get that set up for them. And when they go to create the project, they have a template right there. It'll do all those steps for them.
I just think that's a great lesson learned or best practice right there. If you have a lot of a repetitive task that you're spending a lot of time on, and I simply you could just sit down next to somebody and just say, hey, detail what tasks are you spending a lot of time on. And if there's a couple things that really pop up is like, hey, just doing this over and over again, that's an opportunity for automation. And you can apply that both on the development side, like when you're doing the development, but also on the training side, because maybe you don't need to do the development, maybe the tool or the feature, the function that you want is already there. um, Let me ask you, in terms of how do you manage, because technology, one of the issues is you have to continually update your platform, and how do you manage that?
It never ends. So
Okay.
we have a ticketing system in Jira that we use that we can always enter new feature requests or bug reports, of course, as well as any long-term development needs people might want to meet specific client needs. So we're always have a long queue of future development. We also sit down with people and we usually have quarterly meetings of you know where are the pain points right
Hmm.
now? What things could be done better? What could make it more? What could it? How could have things work that make things easier for anyone? Now, of course, you have to kind of filter that out of someone not knowing how to do that correctly right now. What is a personal preference over something that could be a universal fix that would make it easier for everyone? You can't have a system that's too tailored just to one individual's
Sure.
idiosyncratic ways of working. So there's a filtering there, but it's always a useful conversation to have with all of your users of what features do they need to really make their lives work easier. Because if the system's easier, they're going to be willing to use it
Hmm.
um, more readily than rather than kind of doing things offline. What you want to avoid in any business management system is too much offline work. Because then what happens if someone, God forbid, gets hit by a bus and no one else knows exactly what they've been doing? Because
Hmm.
if they aren't doing it in the business management system, no one has a record of it.
Right.
So making sure people are comfortable using it and it meets their needs is a very important aspect.
What's the process? Because we get tons and tons of feature requests, both from our customers and internally. It's like, oh, well, God, we need this. We definitely need this. And, it's impossible to put them all in the development pipeline. Yeah. And then even the ones that do go into the
Yeah.
pipeline, you have to
Oh,
prioritize.
definitely.
So how do you prioritize? Is that
Yeah.
just a conversation, or is it top down,
Well,
bottom up, or what?
yeah. It becomes it starts bottom up and then goes top down. So first I get any of these sort of requests in, let's say from the project manager who may want something different, things to work in a different way. And I will analyze that, and if I think it's a really great idea, I will go to the management and say, I think this is a really good idea. Here's the benefits for multiple users, and then we
Hmm.
can prioritize that. Um, if it's something I'm not so clear about it having any wider advantage, I will put together a list of the pros and cons and sit
Hmm.
down and discuss with the management, is this something we want to put efforts into? Here's possible benefits you get. Maybe it's only for one client. Is it really worth putting in a lot of development effort to meet one client's need as opposed to how else we'd solve it? And here's the downside, cost or whatever that might be involved. And so we'll make certain priorities based on that. Maybe it's more of a long term, it would be nice to have sort of fix or a new feature. And then, of course, some are just terrible out of the box, and we have to say, no, here's the correct way of doing this. And yes, you have to input this data, and that is maybe not always the most pleasant part of your day to have to enter data. But yes, that is part of your job, and you need to do it.
I'm just curious, at any of your previous employers, such as Bowne or Donnelley or Merrill Corporation, did you ever look at a feature and say, what's the potential ROI on this? Like, if we develop this, it will be able to either reduce costs by X or increase revenue by X. I mean, is that ever come into play?
Well, I'd say that comes into play on almost every feature
Okay,
enhancement or new feature we put in. Now, the problem to me with using the term ROI is it's often very hard to quantify.
sure.
Um, because and once you put a quantification on it, put a dollar amount, let's say, people are going to start holding you to that. And if it
Uh-oh.
doesn't meet it, they're going to say, "Well, you cheated me."
Yeah, yeah,
So I'm always a little hesitant about that. What I try to do is explain, if this can save a specific user 3 minutes on doing this task, and we do that across all of the staff, and let's say X number of days a year, how many, essentially working hours can we save? And how does that relate to, additional staff hires?
sure,
Maybe if you make things more efficient, you can do more work with fewer project managers. Um, which has a number you can assign to it as opposed to hiring someone new to cover that. So if you're just going to say this feature is going to save you $10,000 a year and it doesn't, uh, you know, then people feel cheated. But if you can say that your existing staff can handle more work, um, it's really the same thing, only without coming at it from a different angle.
makes a lot of sense. And I've actually been involved where I mentioned earlier with a LSP that was spent. They invested several million dollars on a TMS, and they were trying to get every business unit to commit to financial both savings and then revenue increases. Because if you have this great tool, what do you what how is this going to help you? And that was a real kind of slippery slope. And as you said, it's hard to really kind of guesstimate that early on. Well, hey, Tom,
Well,
go ahead.
and a CAT tool is maybe a little different than a business management tool in that regard, because a CAT tool you can really quantify, leverage reuse, as opposed to translating everything from scratch.
Well, yeah,
Um,
yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you this: how do you manage, if you, for example, you have an integration with or partnership integration with memoQ has its kind of trajectory, and your BMS system has its trajectory. How do you make sure that they're constantly kind of able to communicate with each other and aligned?
that is a challenge, because I'm not always aware of maybe what memoQ's long-term roadmap is. Maybe they're going to go off in some tangent that is not relevant to us. I don't know. But one of the things we have um, done successfully with memoQ is actually making feature suggestions to
Hmm.
memoQ about how some things could work better. And I will do a formal application for that. And so we've gotten some things that we thought would make the integration better through that. And, trying to uh, explain to memoQ how I think this would benefit not just our company, but lots of LSPs who are using memoQ in this way, because these are common features that an LSP might want. I wouldn't request anything that was just solely specific to our need base. And
That's good.
memoQ's always been very res- uh, responsive to those kind of needs, because you want to make your tool better too. And because of that, we also have recommended memoQ to some of our partners and end clients, because we have started a very limited commercialization of our system,
Hmm.
um, really letting other companies use it who are like-minded,
Hmm.
and also offering them the selection of integrating with memoQ, since that already comes built in, and also allowing them to adapt the system, some bespoke, we might say, customizations for their system that they can develop in the way they want as well.
That's awesome, man. Hey, I've really enjoyed this conversation, Tom. I learned a lot. I've taken a bunch of notes. I am going to find that video and put a link to it. The video you referenced in terms of describing, your unique workflows in your BMS, and how it integrates with memoQ. I'm going to put a link to that in there. Are you or is anybody from Peter Clark attending any industry events this year?
Still up in the air about
Okay.
that. Haven't made any firm plans. Not going to gala this year. We'll probably be reviewing that. It's just all a matter of the COVID situation. We haven't gotten back into that mindset of going out and attending things in person yet.
Okay. Well,
Um,
yeah, we just
but I'm
had
hoping, that changes.
we had our memoQ Fest in Budapest a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, a few people did get COVID. Fortunately, everybody recovered and everybody's fine. But it's really tough at this time to kind of figure, should I risk it, should not, and so on. But if we don't see it in industry event, if I'm out in New York, I will definitely give you a buzz. And if you're out on the West Coast, let me know. But I'd like to wish you and the Peter and Clark team a great remainder of 2022. And thank you again for coming on memoQ Talks.
Well, thank you, Mark.
Thank you for joining memoQ Talks, where we talked with industry leaders about their experiences and lessons learned to gain new insights about what works best across all areas of localization. Join us next time on memoQ Talks.